The story of the Thunder Warriors was one of betrayal and survival. Created by the Emperor to carry out the brutal unification wars, they were not forged with the care and mastery of the Custodian Guard. Instead, they were rushed into being, mass-produced and imperfect, a disposable army meant to unite Terra under one banner. But when their purpose was fulfilled, they were cast aside, slaughtered during the cull at Mount Ararat. Yet not all perished, and not all succumbed to the genetic and physical degradation that plagued them, muscle grafts fraying, organs failing, and bodies breaking under the weight of their enhancements. Some lived for hundreds of years, perhaps not as long as an Astartes, but far longer than any baseline human. They were remnants of an age of war, much more than human and far more dangerous than most could imagine. Arik Taranis and his brother Ghota were among the few who escaped the massacre. Together, they fled into the depths of Terra's Underhive, leaving behind the shattered legacy of the Thunder Warriors. In the shadows of the Hive's endless labyrinth, they carved out a new life, battling assassins, rival gangs, and the crushing weight of their own genetic decay. By sheer force of will and cunning, they had risen. The fighting pits were now theirs, a symbol of their dominance in the Underhive. Arik, the strategist and visionary, had begun laying the foundations of an empire. Ghota, ever the warrior, crushed any who dared stand in their way. Their network of alliances and informants grew daily, pulling the Underhive's fractured factions into their fold. But survival was no longer enough. Arik understood the truth. Power in the Underhive was fragile. Rival factions were already scheming, and whispers of their rise had reached the Midhive. The Imperium above them might remain blind for now, but that would not last. Arik knew that if they were to endure, if they were to thrive, they needed more than territory. They needed control. And so the Thunder Warrior, known as Arik Taranis, began to transform, shedding his past as a tool of war to become something else entirely. In the dark alleys and forgotten chambers of the Petitioners City, a new name began to take root, a name whispered by scavengers, traders, and gang leaders alike. The transformation from Arik Taranis, Thunder Warrior, to Babu Dhakal, crime lord of the Petitioners City, did not happen all at once. It began with careful steps, deliberate choices, and calculated risks. Arik knew that the fighting pits were not enough. The Underhive was a maelstrom of power struggles, and holding a single position, no matter how strong, made you a target. To survive and thrive, he needed to weave his influence into every layer of the Hive's shadowy ecosystem. The Petitioners City was the perfect place to start. It was a sprawling wasteland of collapsed tunnels and shantytowns where the desperate and discarded of the Hive gathered to eke out their miserable existence. Here the Imperium's light barely reached, and the authorities turned a blind eye. For Arik, it was a crucible of potential, a place where the weak could be forged into weapons and the forgotten could be turned into assets. Arik's plan began with control over resources. The supplies captured from the Bloodbinders were redistributed strategically, but never freely. Every ration pack, every crate of weapons or medical aid came with a cost: loyalty. The people of the Petitioners City quickly learned that Babu Dhakal was no mere benefactor. He was a leader, and those who followed him prospered, while those who resisted faded into obscurity, or worse. One such moment of consolidation came when Arik and Ghota visited a decrepit hab block on the edge of the Petitioners City. The building was a crumbling ruin, its walls blackened by years of neglect, and its halls filled with the hollow-eyed stares of scavengers and outcasts. A gang leader named Kroll had claimed the block as his territory, extorting its residents for scraps of food and protection they never received. Arik had already sent word to Kroll, offering an alliance in exchange for loyalty. But Kroll, like so many in the Underhive, mistook mercy for weakness. Dhakal, huh? Kroll sneered as Arik and Ghota entered the block's central hall. He was a wiry man with a scarred face and a jagged blade strapped to his belt. I've heard of you. Heard you've been throwing your weight around, acting like you own this place, but let me tell you something. This block is mine. Always has been, always will be. Ghota took a step forward, his thunder hammer resting casually across his shoulder. That's a bold claim, little man. You sure you want to stick to it? Kroll's men, a ragged group of 6 armed with crude weapons, shifted nervously. They had heard the stories of what Ghota could do in the pits, of how he had crushed men twice his size with a single swing. I'm not afraid of you, Kroll spat, though his voice wavered. Arik raised a hand and Ghota stopped. The smaller Thunder Warrior stepped forward, his sharp eyes locking onto Kroll's. There was no anger in his expression, no threat, only cold calculation. This isn't about fear, Arik said, his voice low and steady. It's about survival. You think you can hold this place with a handful of fighters and a rusted blade? You're wrong. The Midhive won't care when their enforcers sweep through here. The other gangs won't hesitate to take it from you when you show even a hint of weakness. But with me, you'll have protection, stability, a future. Kroll hesitated, glancing at his men. And if I say no, Arik tilted his head slightly, then you're a problem, and problems don't last long in the Underhive. The room fell silent. Kroll's men shifted uneasily, their loyalty to their leader already wavering. Finally, Kroll lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, he muttered. This block is yours. Arik nodded. It always was. Remember that. As the weeks passed, more territories fell under Arik's control. Each conquest was a calculated move, a piece of a larger puzzle. The gangs of the Petitioners City began to whisper his name in reverence and fear. But for Arik, this was only the beginning. Late at night, in the solitude of his quarters, he returned to his studies of the Emperor's genetic science. The salvaged data logs and cogitators held fragments of truth, glimpses into the techniques used to create the Thunder Warriors and their successors. Arik's body was failing, his strength slowly waning as the years took their toll. He knew he didn't have the mastery to repair the damage fully, but he clung to the hope that he could stabilize himself long enough to see his plans through. One fragment of data in particular caught his attention, a reference to the concept of genetic purging, a deliberate design flaw embedded in the Thunder Warriors to ensure their obsolescence. The Emperor had built them to die, to burn bright and burn out. But in doing so, he had left gaps, small cracks in the design that could be exploited given the right tools. Ghota found him hunched over the console one evening, his scarred hands gripping the edge of the table as he stared at the screen. "You're at it again," Ghota said, shaking his head. "You can't stop time, brother. Even if you figure out how we were built, it won't change what we are." Arik didn't look up. It's not about stopping time. It's about understanding it. The Emperor created us to be tools, disposable and flawed, but if we can undo even a part of that, if we can make ourselves whole again. Ghota snorted, leaning against the wall. "And what happens when you figure it out? You think the Imperium will let us live if they find out what you've done?" Arik finally looked at him, his gaze cold and resolute. "They don't have to let us live. They just have to fear what happens if they don't." Ghota grinned, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "Now that's more like it." The name Babu Dhakal was no longer a whisper. It was a presence, a force. Arik's empire was growing, and with it came the first inklings of something greater. The Underhive was no longer a refuge, it was a battleground, and Babu Dhakal intended to win. The name Dhakal was not chosen at random. It carried weight in the Petitioners City, a name once synonymous with ruthless ambition and unrelenting brutality. It was a gang whose reputation had been etched into the darkest corners of the Underhive long before Arik Taranis claimed it as his own. Under his leadership, the Dhakal Gang was no longer just a memory of terror. It had become something far greater. It was an empire in the making. Their rise was swift, marked by precision and savagery. Every territory they claimed, every gang they crushed, strengthened their hold over the Petitioners City. Fear alone didn't drive their expansion. Arik wielded power like a scalpel, using tactics as brutal as they were calculated. Ghota, his hammer and enforcer, ensured those tactics left lasting impressions. But control required more than raids and intimidation. Arik understood that dominance in the Underhive was as much about perception as it was force. The Dhakal Gang's victories were as symbolic as they were practical. And so when the Iron Fangs, a notorious raider gang, refused his offer of alliance, Arik didn't hesitate to make an example of them. The Iron Fangs had fortified themselves in an old manufactorum on the outskirts of the Petitioners City, a rusted relic of the Hive's forgotten industry. Its jagged walls and blocked entrances made it a natural stronghold, and the Fangs believed it would protect them from anyone who dared challenge their rule. They were wrong. Arik stood outside the manufactorum's main gate, his sharp eyes scanning the structure for weaknesses. Beside him, Ghota shifted his hammer on his shoulder, a feral grin splitting his face. "Fortified enough to keep out scavengers," Ghota said, his tone mocking, "but not enough to stop us." "They'll regret this," Arik replied, his voice calm. "But we're not here to wipe them out. Their supplies are worth more than their pride. Remember that." "Fine," Ghota said with a shrug, "but if anyone so much as looks at me the wrong way, I'm flattening them." With a signal from Arik, the Dhakal Gang's fighters moved into position, surrounding the manufactorum. The plan was simple: draw the Fangs' attention to the main gate, then breach their defenses from the rear. Ghota led the frontal assault with characteristic ferocity, smashing through the barricades with his thunder hammer. The sound of splintering metal and panicked shouts filled the air as the Fangs scrambled to mount a defense. Las rifle fire lit up the gloom, but Ghota pressed forward, his armor shrugging off most of the incoming shots. Meanwhile, Arik and his hand-picked team slipped through a crumbling side wall, moving with silent precision. And the Fangs had left their flanks poorly defended, too focused on Ghota's destructive advance. Within minutes, Arik's team was inside, disabling the raiders' heavy weapons and cutting off their escape routes. By the time the Iron Fangs realized they were surrounded, it was already over. Kolvar, the Fangs' leader, was dragged before Arik, his face bloodied but his defiance unbroken. "You think this changes anything?" Kolvar spat, his voice thick with rage. "There's always another gang, always someone stronger." Arik crouched down, his cold gaze locking onto Kolvar's. "Not this time. The Dhakal Gang isn't just another gang. We're the beginning of something you can't stop." Kolvar snarled, lunging toward him, but Ghota stepped forward, his hammer poised. "Go on," Ghota growled. "Give me a reason." Kolvar froze, his defiance faltering as he looked between Arik and Ghota. Slowly, he slumped back, his shoulders sagging. "This block is yours," Kolvar muttered. "It always was," Arik said, standing. In the days that followed, the remnants of the Iron Fangs were absorbed into the Dhakal Gang. Their resources, weapons, food stores, and salvage machinery were redistributed to strengthen Arik's growing empire. But the raid wasn't just about supplies. It was about sending a message. The Dhakal Gang was no longer content to simply survive. They were taking control, one piece at a time. And the Petitioners City was beginning to understand that resistance was no longer an option. Yet for all their victories, Arik knew that control was fragile. In the solitude of his quarters, he returned to the salvaged genetic data from the Emperor's lab, his hands trembling faintly as he scrolled through fragmented sequences. The decay in his body was accelerating, his once unyielding strength now faltering in small but noticeable ways. Ghota found him at the console one evening, his expression darkening as he saw the strain in his brother's posture. "You're overthinking again," Ghota said, leaning against the wall. "The gang's stronger than ever. You've got the city eating out of your hand. What else do you need?" Arik didn't look up. "Strength alone isn't enough. Not here. Not for what we're building." Ghota snorted. "You think too much. Let the city fear us. That's all the strength we need." "No," Arik said, his voice quiet but firm. "Fear fades, and when it does, they'll turn on us. If we're going to hold this city, really hold it, we need more than fear. We need permanence." Ghota tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "And how do you plan on getting that?" Arik's gaze drifted to the genetic data glowing on the console. "By fixing what's broken." The Underhive's chaos had always been ignored by the higher levels of Terra. To the Midhive nobles, the Petitioners City was an unremarkable wasteland, a tangle of forgotten lives eking out existence far below the spires of power. But with the rise of the Dhakal Gang, that neglect had begun to shift. Trade routes from the lower to Midhive, once controlled by various minor factions, had been disrupted. Caravans that once paid tribute to Midhive overseers now bowed to Arik Taranis' rule. Supplies that should have gone to factories and vaults above now filled the coffers of the Dhakal Gang. Word of these disruptions spread quietly at first, whispered among merchants and smugglers, but soon the name Babu Dhakal began to reach ears it was never meant to. In the dim glow of his quarters, Arik stood over a rough map of the Petitioners City, etched onto a sheet of salvaged plasteel. The Dhakal Gang's territory was marked in bold strokes, cutting through the chaos of the Underhive like a jagged scar. Around him, the hum of cogitators filled the room, their screens flickering with genetic data that Arik had been analyzing late into the nights. Ghota leaned against the wall, his massive form relaxed but his expression sharp. "You've got that look again," he said. "The one that says trouble's coming." "Trouble always comes," Arik replied, not looking up from the map. "The Midhive has noticed us." Ghota raised an eyebrow. "Let them notice. What are they going to do? Send one of their toy soldiers down here?" "Maybe," Arik said, his tone measured. "Or maybe they'll try something subtler. The Midhive doesn't like to get its hands dirty, but they don't ignore problems that cost them money." Ghota smirked. "Well, if they send someone, we'll send them back in pieces." Before Arik could reply, the door slid open, and one of his informants stepped in, a wiry man with a nervous energy and darting eyes. "They're here," the informant said, his voice barely above a whisper. Arik's gaze snapped to him. "Who?" "A representative from the Midhive," the informant replied. "Came down with a small retinue. Says they want to meet with you. They're waiting near the old water cisterns." Ghota let out a short laugh, pushing off the wall. "Looks like they're braver than I thought. Or dumber." Arik turned back to the map, his mind already racing. "A Midhive envoy wouldn't come down here alone. They'll have an agenda." He tapped the edge of the plasteel, his voice sharpening. "Get a team together. I want eyes on every approach to the cisterns." Ghota frowned. "You think it's a trap?" "It's always a trap," Arik said, grabbing his chain axe from the table. "The question is, whose trap is it?" The cisterns were a cavernous space, their walls slick with condensation and streaked with centuries of rust. Broken pipelines crisscrossed the ceiling like a web of veins, and pools of stagnant water reflected the faint glow of lumen strips. Arik arrived with Ghota and a small group of fighters, their presence filling the room with quiet menace. Across the chamber stood the envoy, a slender figure dressed in a sharp, tailored coat that contrasted starkly with the grime of the Underhive. Behind the envoy stood 3 armed guards, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. The envoy smiled faintly as Arik approached, their confidence unshaken despite the clear danger surrounding them. "You must be Babu Dhakal," they said, their voice smooth and practiced. "I am," Arik replied, his tone cold. "And you are?" "Call me Elias," the envoy said. "I represent interests from the Midhive, interests that have become concerned about the disruptions caused by your recent activities." "Disruptions," Arik repeated, his sharp gaze narrowing. "Is that what you call survival?" Elias spread their hands in a placating gesture. "You've built something impressive down here, Dhakal, but survival is one thing, interference is another. Trade routes have shifted, resources are being diverted. People are starting to talk about you, people who don't like surprises." Ghota stepped forward, his thunder hammer resting heavily on his shoulder. "If your bosses don't like surprises, maybe they should stay out of the Underhive." Elias chuckled softly, unperturbed. "My bosses don't come down here, of course. That's why they sent me to deliver a simple message. Stop expanding. Stay in your little corner of the Underhive, and there won't be a problem. But if you keep disrupting the flow of trade, there will be consequences." For a moment, the chamber was silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Then Arik stepped closer, his voice low and deliberate. "You've seen what we can do. Tell your masters that the Petitioners City belongs to the Dhakal Gang now. If they want trade to flow, they'll work through us. If they try to stop us," Ghota grinned, baring his teeth, "we'll make sure they regret it." Elias regarded them for a long moment before inclining their heads slightly. "I'll deliver your message." As the envoy turned to leave, Arik's fighters closed ranks behind them, their weapons ready in case of treachery. But Elias and their guards disappeared into the tunnels without incident, leaving only the faint echo of their footsteps behind. Back in their quarters, Ghota dropped into a chair, his grin widening. "That went better than I expected. No bloodshed. No mess. Almost disappointing." Arik didn't respond immediately. He stood at the map, his fingers tracing the edges of the Dhakal Gang's territory. "They'll be back," he said finally. "They were testing us, seeing how far we'd push." Ghota shrugged. "Let them come. We'll crush them like the rest." Arik's gaze darkened. "The Midhive doesn't fight like us. They don't fight fair. If we're going to survive this, we'll need more than strength. We'll need to outthink them." Ghota leaned back, his grin fading slightly. "So what's the plan?" Arik didn't answer immediately, his mind already turning over the possibilities. The Midhive was watching now, and the game had changed. The question wasn't whether they could win, it was how far they were willing to go to do it. The Underhive was restless. Word of the Midhive's envoy spread faster than Arik would have liked, carried on the lips of traders, smugglers, and scavengers. The Dhakal Gang's growing dominance had been an open secret for months, but now it was undeniable. Someone above had noticed them. For many, this was a cause for fear. For others, it was an opportunity. Arik sat in his command room, poring over reports from his network of informants. The pieces of the Midhive's power were starting to come into focus. Trade syndicates, enforcer patrols, and ambitious nobles all circling the Petitioners City like vultures. But it wasn't just the Midhive that concerned him. Within his own ranks, the cracks were beginning to show. "You should rest," Ghota said, leaning against the doorway. He'd taken to watching Arik more closely these days, his tone softer but still carrying its usual gruffness. "Even you can't outthink the whole hive in one night." "I don't have to outthink the hive," Arik replied, his tone sharp but distracted. "Just the people who think they can challenge me." Ghota frowned. "You're talking about the nobles or our own?" Arik didn't answer immediately. He reached for one of the reports, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the page. "Both." The first sign of dissent came from a group of fighters who had once served the Iron Fangs. They had been folded into the Dhakal Gang after Arik's takeover, but their loyalty had always been tenuous. For months, they had grumbled quietly about Arik's leadership, but now their discontent was beginning to spread. It came to a head during a supply run to one of the outlying districts. The fighters were tasked with escorting a shipment of weapons and food, but instead of delivering it, they disappeared into the tunnels, taking the supplies with them. When news of the betrayal reached Arik, he didn't react with anger. Instead, he stood in silence, his expression unreadable as his lieutenant explained the situation. "They've gone to ground," the lieutenant said, his voice tense. "Word is they're trying to rally some of the other gangs, ones that aren't too happy about you taking over." Ghota, standing nearby, slammed his hammer against the floor with a deafening crack. "Let me hunt them down. I'll drag them back in pieces if I have to." "No," Arik said calmly. "We don't waste time on displays of strength. Let them think they've escaped. They'll feel safe, and that's when we'll strike." Ghota's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that?" This kind of thing spreads if you don't squash it fast." "It spreads faster if we overreact," Arik replied. He turned to the lieutenant, his tone cold and precise. "Get me their location. Quietly. No one outside this room hears a word about it until I say so." The lieutenant nodded and hurried out, leaving Arik and Ghota alone. "You're getting soft," Ghota said after a moment, his tone half joking. "No," Arik said, his voice low. "I'm thinking long term. Kill a few rebels and you send a message, but kill them too soon and the wrong people get the wrong idea." Ghota crossed his arms, leaning back slightly. "And what idea is that?" "That I'm desperate," Arik said, "and desperation is a weakness we can't afford." While Arik dealt with the growing cracks in his empire, another problem was making its way toward the Petitioners City. A group of fugitives had slipped into the Underhive, their presence stirring trouble in the already fragile ecosystem of the lower levels. The fugitives were no ordinary band of scavengers. They were armed, disciplined, and well-organized, traits that set them apart from the usual rabble. Rumors spread quickly about who they were: deserters from a failed rebellion in the Midhive, rogue enforcers, or perhaps even remnants of a noble house fallen from grace. Arik's informants brought him conflicting reports, but one detail remained consistent. These outsiders were dangerous. "They've been moving through the southern districts," one informant told him, his voice trembling slightly under Arik's intense gaze. "Hit 2 supply caches already. Took everything they could carry, left the guards dead." Arik leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered the information. "And they're not working with anyone?" "No," the informant replied. "At least not yet. But some of the smaller gangs are starting to talk. They think these outsiders might be strong enough to challenge you." Ghota, seated nearby, let out a low growl. "Strong enough? They'll be lucky to last a week. Let me take a squad and deal with them." "No," Arik said, shaking his head. "Not yet. We need to know who they are first and what they want. If they're smart, they'll see joining us as their only option. If they're not, we'll deal with them." Ghota frowned. You're giving them a chance? I'm giving them a choice, Arik corrected. And if they choose wrong, they'll serve as an example to everyone else. As the days passed, tensions continued to rise. The deserters from the Iron Fangs remained hidden, and the fugitives in the southern districts grew bolder with each raid. Arik moved his pieces carefully, ensuring that every action he took reinforced his control over the Petitioners City, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. In the quiet moments of the night, he returned to the genetic data from the Emperor's lab, his mind racing as he searched for solutions. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. The stillness of the Underhive was deceptive, masking the growing tensions that threatened to unravel all that Arik had built. Between the dissent within his own ranks and the fugitives sowing chaos in the southern districts, the Petitioners City was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Yet Arik's focus remained split, half on the crumbling foundation of his empire and half on his deteriorating body. Each day, the signs became harder to ignore. His strength, once unyielding, now faltered at the edges. Wounds that would have closed in minutes during his prime took hours, even days, to heal. A dull ache lingered in his muscles, a constant reminder of the genetic flaws embedded in his very being. He hid it well, of course. To his followers, Arik Taranis was still Babu Dhakal, the unshakable ruler of the Underhive. But Ghota saw through the mask. "You've been avoiding the pits," Ghota said one evening, his tone unusually serious. He leaned against the doorway to Arik's quarters, his thunder hammer resting against the wall. Arik didn't look up from the glowing cogitator in front of him, its screen filled with fragmented data logs and genetic sequences. "The pits don't need me anymore," he replied. "Our hold there is solid." "That's not the point," Ghota said, stepping closer. "The men need to see you. Remind them why they follow us." "They follow because they don't have a choice," Arik said, his tone cold. Ghota frowned, his arms crossing. "You're wrong. They follow because they believe you're something more than they are. If they see you hiding in here, staring at those damned machines all day, they'll start to doubt." Arik finally looked up, his sharp gaze meeting Ghota's. "And what would you have me do? Step into the arena, swing an axe around, and pretend everything's fine?" Ghota's expression darkened. "You don't have to pretend anything. You just have to remind them that you're still their leader." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Arik turned back to the cogitator, his voice quiet. "I'm doing what I have to. If they doubt me now, they'll understand soon enough." Ghota shook his head, muttering under his breath as he turned to leave. "Just don't forget what you are, brother. You're not one of them. You're a thunder warrior." Later that night, in the solitude of his quarters, Arik stared at the fragments of genetic data on the screen. Each sequence told the same story: decay. The muscle grafts, the reinforced organs, the accelerated metabolic pathways, they had all been designed for short-term efficiency. The Thunder Warriors were meant to burn brightly and die quickly, discarded as soon as their purpose was fulfilled. And yet, here he was. A small smile crossed his lips as he considered the irony. The Emperor, for all his vision and genius, hadn't accounted for the sheer stubbornness of his creations. One file in particular caught Arik's attention. It was an older fragment, corrupted and incomplete, but the data it contained hinted at something unsettling. A reference to genetic resonance and the use of external forces to stabilize unstable sequences. The wording was vague, but it triggered a memory, an old battlefield from the Unification Wars, a place called Malin Sen. The air there had been heavy, charged with a dark energy that seemed to seep into the earth itself. The custodians had been uneasy in that place, their perfect genetic forms repelled by the strange forces at work. But for the Thunder Warriors, it had been different. They had thrived in that chaos, their strength amplified, their wounds closing faster than ever. Arik's hands tightened on the edge of the console. The Emperor had never explained what had happened at Malin Sen, but now, looking at the data before him, Arik began to suspect the truth. The Thunder Warriors weren't just flawed, they had been created in haste, using methods the Emperor would never admit to. "Chaos," he muttered under his breath, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Was it possible that the Emperor had tapped into the forces of the warp to stabilize the Thunder Warriors' genetic structure? Had he used the very thing he sought to destroy to create his first army? The thought sent a shiver down Arik's spine, but it also lit a spark of hope. If the Emperor had done it once, perhaps Arik could do it again. The next morning, Arik gathered his most trusted lieutenants in the command room. A hollow map of the Underhive flickered on the table before them, marking key locations controlled by the Dhakal Gang and their rivals. The fugitives in the southern districts, Arik began, his voice steady. What do we know about them? One of the lieutenants, a wiry woman named Shira, stepped forward. They've hit 3 more caches in the last week. They're well-armed and well-organized. We've tracked them to an old hab block near the collapse zone, but they've fortified it heavily. Arik nodded, his expression unreadable. They're becoming a problem. If they're allowed to keep operating, they'll inspire others to defy us. We take them out then, Ghota said, his hammer resting heavily on the table. Send a message. Not yet, Arik replied. First, we need to know who they are and what they want. If they're mid-hive deserters, they might be useful. If they're just scavengers, we'll crush them. Shira hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. Some of the smaller gangs have started talking about them, calling them the ghosts. They think these fugitives might have been sent by the Midhive to destabilize us. Ghota snorted. Let them think that. Ghosts or not, they'll bleed like anyone else. Arik's gaze lingered on the holomap, his mind already turning over the possibilities. The ghosts were an unknown factor, and in the Underhive, the unknown was always dangerous. Double the patrols around our territories, he said finally, and send word to the southern districts. We'll give these ghosts a chance to join us. If they refuse, we'll remind them why the Dhakal Gang runs the Petitioners City. Alone in his quarters later that evening, Arik returned to the genetic data. His body was failing, his empire was fragile, and the Midhive was watching. The Petitioners City was on edge. The ghosts, as the fugitive group in the southern districts had come to be known, were gaining ground. Their raids were no longer limited to supply caches. Now, smaller gangs were pledging allegiance to them, drawn in by their discipline and their whispered promises of liberation from the Dhakal Gang's rule. For Arik, it was a game of patience. Every report from his informants was another piece of the puzzle, a slow unraveling of the ghosts' true purpose. Were they simply scavengers growing bolder with stolen supplies? Or were they something more, a weapon sent by the Midhive to destabilize his empire? Ghota, as always, was less concerned with questions. He wanted action. They're testing us, Ghota growled, pacing in Arik's quarters as reports flickered across the cogitator screen. And you're letting them get away with it. I'm letting them show their hand, Arik replied, his tone sharp but calm. Every move they make tells us something. Their tactics, their alliances, their weaknesses. Ghota slammed a fist into the wall, the impact leaving a dent in the reinforced metal. You're overthinking this, brother. We crush them now, and no one else will dare rise against us. Arik turned to face him, his eyes cold. And if they're connected to the Midhive, if they have allies waiting to strike the moment we show weakness, this isn't just about strength, Ghota. It's about control. Ghota's scowl deepened, but he didn't argue further. He knew better than to question Arik's judgment, even if it grated against his instincts. It was late that night when one of Arik's informants brought him news that changed everything. The ghosts aren't just scavengers, the man said, his voice low and urgent. They've been working with someone from the Midhive, a noble, by the look of it, name's Darion Helmsfall. He's been using the ghosts to disrupt your operations while staying safe in his spire. Arik leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Helmsfall, he repeated, the name unfamiliar. The informant nodded quickly. He's a lesser noble, but well-connected. Word is he's trying to make a name for himself by taking control of trade routes in the Underhive. The ghosts are his first move. Arik's mind raced. This was no longer just a skirmish in the Underhive. It was the opening move in a larger game, one that could either solidify his empire or tear it apart. Does Helmsfall come down here? Arik asked. The informant hesitated. Not often, but he's been seen near the lower levels of the Midhive, close enough to oversee his operations, but far enough to stay out of danger. Arik's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we bring the danger to him. The decision to target a Midhive noble was not one Arik made lightly. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could draw the attention of the Imperium if handled poorly. But Helmsfall had made the first move, and Arik knew that waiting too long to respond would only embolden him. Ghota was, unsurprisingly, thrilled by the plan. "Finally," Ghota said, his grin wide as he hefted his hammer. "No more sitting around. Let's show this noble what happens when he meddles with us." "It's not just about him," Arik said, his tone measured. "We need to send a message to anyone else who thinks they can use the Underhive as their playground." The plan was simple, but precise. Arik and Ghota would lead a small team into the lower Midhive, using the knowledge gathered by their informants to infiltrate Helmsfall's territory. The goal was not to kill the noble outright, but to cripple his operations and force him to withdraw his support from the ghosts. The night before the mission, Arik sat alone in his quarters, staring at the cogitator screen. The genetic data he had been studying flickered before him, fragments of information that hinted at answers just out of reach. His body ached, his muscles weaker than they had been even a month ago, but his mind remained sharp and his will was unbroken. "You're quiet tonight," Ghota said, stepping into the room. Arik didn't look up. "We're about to step into a lion's den. I'm thinking." Ghota smirked. "You always think too much. That's why I'm here, to remind you when it's time to act." Arik allowed a small smile. "And that's why we make a good team." Ghota's grin widened. "Damn right." The descent into the lower Midhive was a stark contrast to the Underhive's chaotic sprawl. The air here was cleaner, the structures more intact, but the tension was just as thick. Arik's team moved through the shadows, avoiding patrols and surveillance systems as they closed in on Helmsfall's operations hub, a fortified warehouse nestled at the edge of a Midhive trade route. Inside, Helmsfall's men worked quickly, loading crates of supplies onto waiting transports. The noble himself stood on an elevated platform, overseeing the operation with an air of practiced authority. He was younger than Arik had expected, his sharp features and pristine clothing marking him as someone who had never known hardship. Arik's grip tightened on his chain axe. "He doesn't belong here," he muttered. Ghota grinned, his hammer resting on his shoulder. "Then let's remind him of that." The attack was swift and brutal. Arik's team struck with precision, cutting through Helmsfall's guards before they had a chance to react. The transports were disabled, their cargo destroyed, and the noble's carefully orchestrated operation was thrown into chaos. Helmsfall himself barely escaped, fleeing deeper into the Midhive with a handful of guards. Arik let him go, for now. The message had been sent. Back in the Petitioners City, the Ghost's raids slowed to a halt. Word of the Dhakal Gang's strike against Helmsfall spread quickly, and the smaller gangs that had begun to waver in their loyalty returned to Arik's fold. In his quarters, Arik stood over the holomap, his expression grim but satisfied. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Helmsfall would regroup, and the Midhive would not ignore the attack for long. "We've made our move," Arik said quietly. "Now we see how they respond." Ghota, standing beside him, chuckled. "Let them come. We'll be ready." Arik nodded, his gaze fixed on the map. The Dhakal Gang was stronger than ever, but so were the threats surrounding them. For now, all he could do was prepare for the storm to come. The Petitioners City had returned to a fragile calm, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. The ghosts had gone silent, their ranks fractured by Arik's assault on Helmsfall's operations. Smaller gangs that had wavered in their loyalty were now back under Dhakal control. For the first time in weeks, it seemed the Dhakal Gang could breathe, but Arik Taranis knew better than to trust the quiet. He stood on the observation deck overlooking the fighting pits, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd below. The pits, once chaotic and uncontrolled, were now a carefully curated display of dominance. Fighters battled for survival, their blood spilled for the entertainment of the Underhive's desperate masses. Arik had allowed the pits to continue, but they were no longer a place of random violence. Now, every fight was a reminder of who ruled the Petitioners City. Behind him, Ghota leaned against the railing, his hammer resting on his shoulder. "They're restless," he said, nodding toward the crowd. "Too many people in one place, all waiting for something to happen." "They always wait," Arik replied, his tone cold. "It's what they do when they have nothing else. Wait for someone stronger to make the first move." Ghota smirked. "And what happens when they realize there's no one stronger?" Arik turned, his gaze locking onto Ghota. They look for weakness instead. The cracks in the Dhakal Gang's foundation were growing harder to ignore. The Midhive's interference had shaken some of Arik's lieutenants, and whispers of dissent had begun to spread. Even Ghota, Arik's most loyal companion, had grown restless, his frustration with Arik's cautious approach boiling just beneath the surface. It was during a meeting with his inner circle that the tension finally spilled over. "We've been reacting to everything," said Leora, a former gang leader who now oversaw the Dhakal Gang's logistics. Her voice was sharp, but her fear was clear. "The ghosts, the Midhive, the deserters, they're dictating every move we make. If we don't take control, someone else will." "And what would you suggest?" Arik asked, his voice calm but cutting. Leora hesitated, glancing at the others around the table. "We need to strike first, show them we're not just sitting here waiting for the next attack. If we take the fight to the Midhive—" "Enough," Arik said, cutting her off. He stood slowly, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the room. "Striking the Midhive directly is exactly what they want. They're baiting us into overreaching." Leora started to speak again, but Ghota's booming voice cut through the room. "Maybe she's right," Ghota said, his tone harsher than usual. "We've been sitting on our hands, waiting for the next move. It's not like you, brother." "And what do you think we should do, Ghota? March into the Midhive and declare war on the Imperium?" Ghota slammed his hammer onto the table, the impact making the other lieutenants flinch. "I think we should remind them who we are. The Thunder Warriors didn't survive because we played it safe." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Arik spoke, his voice low but firm. "We're not Thunder Warriors anymore. We're something else, something stronger. If you can't see that, you're welcome to leave." For a moment, Ghota looked as though he might argue, but then he leaned back, his scowl deepening. "Your call, brother, but don't expect me to sit around forever while the Midhive moves against us." That night, alone in his quarters, Arik stared at the genetic data flickering on the cogitator screen. His body ached, the strain of his failing physiology becoming harder to hide. Every day he felt the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him. The data offered no clear solutions, only fragments of possibilities. The concept of genetic resonance lingered in his mind, a faint echo of the Emperor's work that hinted at stability, at permanence. But the cost of pursuing that path was unclear and potentially catastrophic. His thoughts drifted back to Malin Sen, to the dark energy that had empowered the Thunder Warriors on that battlefield. Was it possible that the key to his survival lay in the very forces the Emperor had sought to eradicate? Arik's hands tightened on the edge of the console. He couldn't afford to falter now, not with the Midhive watching, not with his empire hanging by a thread. But the path forward was unclear, and every step he took felt like walking a razor's edge. The next morning, Arik called his lieutenants to the command room. The hollow map of the Underhive flickered before them, marking key locations controlled by the Dhakal Gang and their rivals. "We're moving against the ghosts," Arik said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They've had enough time to regroup. It ends now." Leora frowned. "And what about the Midhive? If they retaliate?" "We'll deal with that when it happens," Arik said sharply. "For now, we secure our position. The ghosts are a distraction we can't afford." Ghota grinned, his usual confidence returning. "Finally. About time we reminded this city who runs it." Arik nodded. "Gather the men. We move at nightfall." The Petitioners City braced for another storm, its shadows alive with the whispers of war. The ghosts, the Midhive, the dissent within the Dhakal Gang, it all loomed over Arik like a gathering tide. But Babu Dhakal was not a man who broke under pressure. He thrived in the chaos, forging his empire one step at a time. As night fell, the Dhakal Gang prepared for battle, their weapons gleaming in the dim light of the Underhive. And at their head stood Arik, his resolve unshaken, his mind fixed on the fight ahead. The Underhive was alive with tension as the Dhakal Gang mobilized. Their target, the Ghosts, a rogue faction that had eluded them for far too long. For weeks, these fugitives had been more than a nuisance. They had threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power Arik had worked so ruthlessly to establish. Tonight, that would end. Arik moved through the ranks of his fighters as they prepared, his presence commanding silence and focus. The Ghosts had fortified themselves in an old hab block near the collapse zone, a precarious location riddled with unstable structures and treacherous tunnels. It was the perfect stronghold for fugitives, and a perfect trap for anyone foolish enough to attack unprepared. But Arik wasn't unprepared. "Remember," he said, addressing the gathered fighters, "we're not here to waste lives. The ghosts are disciplined, but they're not invincible. Stay in formation, cover each other, and most importantly, remember why we fight." Ghota stood beside him, his thunderhammer resting on the ground with a heavy thud. "If you're scared, stay behind," he added, his grin wide. "The rest of us have work to do." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd, but the tension remained. They all knew what was at stake. The approach to the ghost's hideout was eerily quiet. The collapse zone was a maze of rubble and shadows, the air heavy with the stench of decay. Arik led the way, his chain axe in hand, its teeth humming softly in anticipation. Ghota followed close behind, his hammer resting lightly on his shoulder, ready to swing at a moment's notice. They moved like predators through the dark, their steps measured and deliberate. Scouts reported back in whispers, detailing the ghost's defenses: barricades at key entry points, snipers in elevated positions, and patrols circling the perimeter. It was a solid defense, but Arik saw the flaws immediately. "They've spread themselves too thin," he said quietly to Ghota. "They're trying to cover too much ground." Ghota grinned. "Makes it easier for us." Arik nodded. "Take the heavy fighters around to the south entrance. Hit them hard and draw their attention. I'll take the infiltration team through the west tunnels and hit their center while they're distracted." Ghota's grin widened. "Thought you'd never let me have the fun part." "You call smashing through walls fun?" Arik muttered, a faint smirk touching his lips. "Damn right," Ghota replied before motioning to his team. The first explosion shattered the silence. Ghota's hammer smashed through the south entrance with thunderous force, his team surging forward in a wave of violence. The ghosts reacted immediately, their snipers firing from elevated positions, but Ghota's team pressed on, their sheer brutality overwhelming the defenders. At the same time, Arik and his infiltration team slipped through the west tunnels, moving with surgical precision. They neutralized sentries silently, their blades flashing in the dim light. By the time the ghosts realized they were under attack from two fronts, it was too late. Arik's team emerged into the heart of the Hab block, where the ghosts' leader, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, barked orders to her fighters. "You've overreached," Arik said, his voice cutting through the chaos as he stepped into the light. The woman turned, her gaze locking onto him. For a moment, she looked surprised, but the expression quickly turned to resolve. "You're the one they call Babu Dhakal," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I expected someone taller." Arik tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And I expected someone smarter." With that, the battle erupted around them. The ghosts fought fiercely, their discipline evident in the way they moved and covered each other, but they were no match for the Dhakal Gang's sheer ferocity. Ghota's team broke through the south entrance moments later, his thunderhammer smashing through barricades and sending defenders flying. The sight of the massive Thunder Warrior tearing through their ranks broke the ghosts' morale, and their formation began to crumble. Arik moved through the chaos with practiced precision, his chain axe a blur as it cut down anyone who stood in his way. He reached the ghost's leader as she tried to rally her remaining fighters, their eyes meeting for a brief moment before he struck. The fight was over in seconds. As the dust settled, Arik stood in the center of the ruined Hab block, his chest heaving with exertion. The ghost survivors were rounded up by his fighters, their weapons confiscated and their hands bound. Ghota approached, his hammer resting on his shoulder and a grin on his face. "That wasn't so bad," he said. "What do we do with the rest of them?" Arik looked around, his gaze cold. "The ones who fought well will be given a choice. Join us or die. The rest are useless." Ghota nodded, his grin fading slightly. He understood what needed to be done, but even he felt the weight of the decision. Arik turned to the ghost's leader, who knelt before him, blood dripping from a wound on her forehead. "Why did Helmsfall send you?" he asked, his voice quiet but deadly. The woman spat blood onto the ground. "Helmsfall doesn't care about us," she said. "We were just tools, same as you." Arik's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he motioned to his fighters. "Take her back to the command post. She might still be useful." Back in the Petitioners City, The victory was celebrated as a triumph. The ghosts were broken, and the Dhakal Gang's dominance was reinforced. But for Arik, the battle was just another step in a larger war. Helmsfall was still out there, and the Midhive's attention was now fully on him. As he sat alone in his quarters that night, staring once again at the genetic data on his cogitator screen, he couldn't shake the ghost leader's words from his mind. "Just tools," he muttered to himself, his hands tightening into fists. He wouldn't be a tool. Not for the Midhive, not for the Imperium, and certainly not for the Emperor. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight was far from over. The victory over the ghosts solidified the Dhakal Gang's rule over the Petitioners City. News of the battle spread quickly through the Underhive, carried by scavengers, traders, and the few surviving ghosts who'd been given their lives in exchange for servitude. For now, Arik's empire was secure, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the Midhive moved again. In the days that followed, Arik took to the streets personally, an act he rarely indulged in. His presence sent ripples through the city, silencing whispers of dissent and reminding the people who truly held power. He visited the pits where fighters bowed as he passed, their fear and respect tangible in the air. He stood on the balconies overlooking the lower districts, watching as scavengers and laborers worked under the watchful eyes of Dhakal enforcers. Everywhere he went, his name was spoken in hushed tones, Babu Dhakal, ruler of the Underhive. But behind the show of strength, the cracks remained. In the dim light of the command room, Arik stared at the ghost's leader, who knelt before him in chains. The woman, who had yet to give her name, was bruised and bloodied but defiant. "You've done well to survive," Arik said, his voice calm but cold. "That's not something I take lightly." The woman spat at his feet. "Spare me the compliments, Dhakal. You're just another warlord with delusions of grandeur." Arik's expression didn't change. He crouched down to meet her gaze, his sharp eyes boring into hers. "And what does that make you? A failed pawn of a Midhive noble? A leader who couldn't hold her own territory?" The woman didn't respond, her jaw tightening. "I can use people like you," Arik continued. "You know how to lead, you know how to fight, but more importantly, you know how to survive. Work for me, and you'll live long enough to see the next sunrise. Refuse." And he let the words hang in the air, the implication clear. For a moment, the woman remained silent, her eyes flickering with indecision. Then finally, she nodded. "Fine. I'll work for you, but don't think for a second I'm loyal." "I don't need loyalty," Arik said, standing. "Just results." While Arik worked to consolidate his new gains, Ghota had become restless. The thrill of battle was his lifeblood, and the calm after the ghost's defeat left him with little to do but patrol the gang's growing territories. One evening, he found himself in the pits, watching a match between two seasoned fighters. The crowd roared as blood spilled onto the sand, but Ghota's mind was elsewhere. "We've gotten soft," he muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing. A voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Or smarter." Ghota turned to see Leora, the logistics overseer, standing behind him with a faint smirk. "You don't look like the type who enjoys fights," Ghota said, his tone gruff. Leora shrugged. "I don't, but I do enjoy seeing how people react to pressure. It tells you more about them than any conversation ever could." Ghota grunted, turning back to the fight. "Pressure doesn't change anything. You either win or you don't. That's all there is." "Spoken like a warrior," Leora said, her smirk fading, "but not a leader." Ghota shot her a sharp look, but before he could respond, one of Arik's lieutenants approached, their expression tense. "Ghota," the lieutenant said, "Arik wants to see you. It's urgent." When Ghota arrived at the command room, he found Arik hunched over his cogitator, the glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across his face. "What is it?" Ghota asked, his tone wary. Arik didn't look up. Helmsfall's regrouping. They're moving assets into the lower levels, preparing for something bigger. Ghota's hands clenched into fists. "Then we hit them first." Arik finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "No, not yet. Let them make the first move. If we attack now, we'll be playing their game." Ghota scowled. "We've been playing their game this whole time. How long are we going to wait?" "As long as it takes," Arik replied. "We're not ready for a full-scale war with the Midhive. If we're going to win, we need to be smarter." Ghota's frustration boiled over. "Smarter? You've been saying that for weeks, brother, but all I see is us sitting here while they close in around us. If we don't act, we'll lose everything. And if we act too soon, we'll lose more than that. Arik shot back, his voice rising for the first time. The two Thunder Warriors stared at each other, the tension between them thick. For a moment, it seemed as though the fragile alliance that had carried them this far might break. Then Ghota stepped back, his jaw tightening. Fine, your call as always, but don't expect me to sit idle forever. Arik watched him go, a flicker of regret crossing his face. Ghota was his oldest ally, his most trusted enforcer, but even their bond was not immune to the pressures of the Underhive. That night, as the Petitioners City settled into an uneasy silence, Arik returned to his genetic experiments. The data he had been studying offered no solutions, only questions. The references to genetic resonance and the Emperor's early experiments with the warp haunted him, the implications too dangerous to ignore. If the Thunder Warriors had been created using forces beyond science, then what did that mean for him? For all of them? Arik leaned back in his chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. The Underhive was his empire, but it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He needed answers, he needed strength, and he would do whatever it took to find them. The Dhakal Gang was stronger than ever, its rule over the Petitioners City unchallenged. But cracks had begun to form, cracks that threatened to widen into chasms. The Midhive was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And within the gang itself, dissent simmered beneath the surface. Arik Taranis, the man now known as Babu Dhakal, stood at the center of it all, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He was a leader, a warrior, a relic of a forgotten age, and as the shadows of Terra loomed over him, he prepared for the battles yet to come.